Concerns are mounting about the mental effects of the COVID-19 lockdown as people have had to abruptly adapt to a new way of living. Now, studies indicate that more people are showing signs of depression, fear and loneliness. Clinical psychologist Dr Khosi Jiyane joins us now to talk a little bit more about this. Dr. Jiyane, good evening and thank you so much for your time. A study done by the Human Sciences Research Council indicating that in South Africa, 33% of adult South Africans are depressed during this lockdown. 48% are fearful and 29% are lonely. The chief driver there being hunger. Is it something that is part of a health crisis of this nature to get into a situation where we are seeing more mental health problems?
Well, it certainly is something that exacerbates the pre-existing conditions. I think we need to bear in mind that this condition is in fact, it's a layer on top of a life that existed before. So we have had to shoulder a lot of burden of challenges of all different sorts before this pandemic. And what it did is that it just compounded the problems. So people are dealing with so much more than they did before. So it isn't necessarily that it will initiate, although that too is a factor, but it's also the compound effect that it just, adds to pre-existing. So it precipitates, it speeds up the likelihood that people will gravitate toward clinical conditions.
What about the prolonged nature of the health crisis? What impact does that have?
It is precisely the prolonged nature of it that is a big factor in what is manifesting. Because, you mentioned earlier on that fatigue, that people are C19 fatigued. That when we have a sense that something is about to end, when we have a clear sight of the end of a challenge that we are facing, it helps us to psychologically prepare ourselves to buckle down, to knuckle down, and we can always, we can count ourselves down to it. But with this, the end, we don't know when the end is, and we don't know where we're going to be when the end comes, if it does come. So it just, becomes a burden that is, because also we are dealing with an enemy that we can't see. And we just have to be fearful of our very next move, could be the wrong move. So it really takes a toll on the system, which is already, burdening a whole lot of life challenges, as it were.
We're talking about stresses such as job losses, we're talking social isolation, we're talking children challenges, and we're talking, as you mentioned, general uncertainty about when this will end. Do we have coping resources that can assist?
I think one of the things we've got to recognize, and I say this, it's going to ask a lot of us to dig deeper than we thought we could. There's that when you'll never know how strong you are until being strong is your only option. And this is precisely one of those moments. We really got to dig deep. Not only do we have to dig deep within ourselves, but we've also got to recognize we have to be each other's keepers, because we are only as strong as the next person. Because it may not be COVID itself that we suffer from or that we get infected with, but it may be everything else, the psychological fallout that will happen, which then perhaps renders us even more vulnerable to COVID, as it were.
Now, that tells me, from what you're saying, that the social support becomes a key resource in a pandemic of this nature, knowing that there are people around you that you can rely on. But of course, the added challenge now is that, maybe moving down to level 2, it might be a little bit easier. We have not been able to be with family. We have not been able to have those relationships take care of us in a time of a crisis of this nature. And if that is the case, where do you go?
Yeah, so we are really having to juggle sharp contradictions and living on the knife edge of things, as it were. So we're talking about physical distance, but it's important to not equate physical distance with social distance. So I think one of the big things we have at this era of this condition that we didn't have in generations before, where, you know, you hear about the last big pandemic being in the late 18 or early 1900s or whenever it was. The one element that we have, which is the gift and burden, is the gift of technology. And so we have to use everything possible at our disposal to maximize. We are social relational beings, and our biggest sense of self is in our sense of belonging and connection with others. We are social beings. So we have to do everything that we can to keep those social connections that keep us alive, that gives us our sense of humanity. And so technology is one of those things we have to use to our maximize. So when we cannot physically be with each other, let's keep those ties that bind us together alive and strongly so.
Dr. Khosi Jiyane, clinical psychologist, we thank you for your time tonight.